Okay, we should be live right now. And I'm just coming on really quick to do a quick stream. So, I say quick stream, but that may end up being, an hour knowing me, but I'll try to keep it quick, like 20, 30 minutes max, hopefully less. And we're here just to discuss the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity document, the Bishop of Rome, which set Twitter and social media on fire for a brief period of time. So let's just get straight into it. We don't need any flowery language here. So the first thing that I think that's important with this document is let's start with a paragraph that I like, which is paragraph 7. Now, as you can see, I highlighted it in weird colors. The colors don't mean anything. I was just feeling, I don't know, colorful when I did it. So hopefully it doesn't make it too disgusting for you guys to read on the stream, but let's just zoom in a little bit here so that you guys can read it along with me. So let's read paragraph 9. It says this: "The Dicastery has therefore drafted a new study document on this subject, based on and augmenting the previous text significantly, honoring the reflections on primacy and on the ministry of the Bishop of Rome made by other Christian communions, ecumenical bodies, and theological dialogues with Catholic participation. This paper aims to be an objective and descriptive synthesis of recent developments in ecumenical discussion on this topic. It does not pretend to be a synthesis of the Catholic magisterium or the Catholic response to the ecumenical reflections, nor to be the status questionis of the whole theological debate, but to be the harvesting of the fruits of recent ecumenical dialogues. It reflects, therefore, the insights, but also the limitations of the dialogue documents themselves." Okay, so why has this document been generating controversy? I think the main reason it generated controversy is because, you have two groups. You have like kind of the online people that are really into these contemporary debates over, the post, conciliar Catholic Church and always want there to be a crisis of some form. And look, I'm not necessarily an expert or even super interested in a lot of these things. Maybe I'll become more of one through this channel and commenting on these modern controversies. But fundamentally, the reason this document is controversial is because a lot of non-Catholics as well are basically saying, oh, look, Rome's capitulating, they're admitting that the papacy is false. But this paragraph really undermines that entire claim. Why? Well, one, a lot of the things in this document are simply quotes, or it's almost entirely quotes actually, and summarizing responses to a papal encyclical, that is John Paul II's Ut Unum Sint, made by other communions. So some of the stuff they're talking about was written without Catholic participation, as well as ecumenical bodies and theological dialogues, which do have Catholic participation, but those documents themselves are not binding on Catholics, as we'll get into in a second, as I got into my first stream on this channel. And then it's simply a subjective and descriptive synthesis of what these documents and also what these documents recommend. So it's not saying that the Catholic magisterium has accepted these documents. It's not saying that these documents are fully in line with Catholic teaching. And in fact, it even says here, it is not even about the theological debate on this topic. So it isn't even about whether or not the papal claims are true or false. It is not meant to be a document related to that. It is merely trying to harvest the fruits, summarize these dialogues, and then, just be food for thought, essentially, for Catholic individuals. And it also admits that everything in here not only has their insights, so their fruits, but also their limitations, which is implying that a lot of the stuff they're discussing in here is a limitation that would never actually get accepted into Catholic teaching. So this paragraph alone, paragraph 9, basically undermines every single talking point that you are seeing online to be used as a bludgeon against Catholics with this document. Now, I would also like to note that, and this is a document I brought up in my stream when we were discussing Pine Sap's discussion with Jay Dyer, but it basically says the same thing regarding these commission documents, that these documents only have weight because of the competence and status of their authors or lack thereof. So you're fully free to, and dissent's not even the right word because that has a very specific canonical, kind of definition. But you're totally free as a Catholic to dissent from this, and there's nothing wrong with that. So that's kind of the first thing I wanted to point out. Now, another thing I want to discuss is kind of a more rhetorical point that some people are making on Twitter. And one of those points was made by Ubi Petrus, the big Orthodox apologist who likes to get into the historical stuff, especially the ecclesiological stuff. And he basically said, oh, well, look, this may be not binding, this may not be magisterial, But it's significant because your hand-picked scholars are concluding that Catholicism is wrong. But the problem with that is kind of a fewfold. So one, if you read this document, the vibe you're going to get isn't Catholicism is wrong. The vibe you're going to get is that everyone, including Catholicism, is wrong. You'll find that, it'll basically be saying, oh, the Protestant view of this was wrong and misinterpreted the Catholic view. You'll be finding, oh, the Orthodox view was wrong and actually is more than a primacy of honor. So that first, this whole idea of, oh, is some of these ecumenical documents are saying things that may contradict Vatican I, therefore Vatican I is false, therefore insert whatever denomination or church I am is true. That's not actually what would happen if you just decided to take all of these ecumenical documents at face value, because all of them give and take on both sides of the equation. And essentially you just conclude that everyone is wrong. So that's the first thing I would say to that point. The second thing I would say to that point is, well, if we actually went through what scholars said, the Eastern Orthodox, especially Ubi Petrus, wouldn't like what they have to say either, because these same scholars are going to be the ones saying that icon development was a development, that Nicaea II was a development. These are going to be the same scholars that'll say Pope Leo the Great and, all the popes past Leo were very clearly making papal claims, and to that, for a certain degree, these were accepted by various churches in the East. These same scholars, for example, are going to be, especially if they're Eastern scholars, even the hand-picked ones, probably especially the hand-picked ones, they're probably going to be saying that universalism is true. So this whole Muscalar talking point is not really convincing if you actually think critically about it. So the next thing I would like to point out here is actually, if we're talking about what scholars are conceding, it's not even just conceding from the Catholic point of view. There's even some concessions from the Orthodox in here. So this is paragraph 98 of the document, but it basically is condemning, or not condemning, but it's from one of the dialogues between the Orthodox and Catholic churches, and it actually rejects the idea that the Bishop of Rome's primacy is entirely entirely honorific, but rather it says that that these honorifics actually imply real authority to make real decisions, and that honor implies real responsibility and real authority. And if the primate is indeed inter partes, it is no less primus. So it is basically saying that the primacy of Rome is more than an honorific. Now, I think Ubi's actually on the team where he'd be okay with that statement. I think that there's a couple other Orthodox that would be as well. But fundamentally, it is the main view in Eastern Orthodoxy, especially historically, especially in the wake of Vatican I, which was to reject the idea that the Bishop of Rome had anything more than a primacy of honor. And in fact, to prove that, we can go to the Patriarchal Encyclical of 1895, right here. You can look it up online, and I think I linked it in the description. Now, I think I also took an image of it just because it would be easier to find what I wanted to highlight here. But in paragraph 15, this patriarchal encyclical, which was accepted by all of the major patriarchs, by the way, so this is a pretty big deal. It says that the Bishop of Rome was only basically, first, because only as the bishop of the capital city of the empire, which gave him an honorary prerogative of presidency, considering him simply, okay, that is only, as the bishop of the first order, that is, the first among equals. And later on, when it's discussing how it views the role of the Bishop of Rome in the church, it's, listing all these local churches, and then it noted in the early church, yada yada, the Bishop of Rome had no right to interfere. So they're saying it's purely an honorific. Well, if you at least care about what this document says, which in my opinion you actually shouldn't, which was the whole point of the initial couple minutes of this video, well, it undermines one of the leading Eastern Orthodox ecclesiologies as well. So the idea that it's merely concessions going one direction is not true. And in fact, I think that if we go to paragraph 52, and another thing too, a lot of internet Eastern Orthodox are acting like this is a capitulation to them, but the Protestants get way, way, way more airtime in this document. So the idea that a church with 1 billion people is capitulating to, their little ethnic sect in Eastern Europe is definitely not what's occurring. What actually is occurring is that, there's a couple dialogue documents from them in here, but the vast majority of this is actually, Lutheran Catholic Anglican, and other Protestant groups like that. So that's another thing, that if anyone should be triumphantly trying to talk about this, it's actually probably Protestants. But their apologists don't seem to care about this. So paragraph 52, I'm not going to read it. You can look at the document yourself. It's linked in the description. But basically, in my opinion, it looks like the Lutherans are making certain concessions on the idea of de jure divino, Roman primacy, and they're basically saying, yeah, there's a way that you could probably formulate it that we could accept it. And I don't see how that's not a Catholic win. In paragraph 54, you kind of see a similar thing happening with the Anglican Communion, where it's saying, it might be possible for the churches of the Anglican Communion to recognize the development of the Roman primacy as a gift of divine providence. Obviously, they're defining it slightly differently, but the fact is, the point of the section basically is that, yeah, Protestants, in a certain sense, are saying that they can accept the Catholic doctrine of de jure divino jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome if it is properly qualified. So, if anything, that's a concession towards our point of view. Now, another thing I wanted to point out here is there's a lot of dispute over one of these last pages here, where it's talking about the reinterpretation of Vatican I. And a lot of people are saying, oh, they're trying to throw out Vatican I. So let's just go to this section here, paragraph 146. This process of re-reception has been called for regarding the teaching of Vatican I. The Lutheran Catholic Dialogue in the USA qualifies this process as a reinterpretation and speaks about the possibility of eventually finding new expressions faithful to the original intention and adapted to the changed cultural context. Okay? Well, what is it saying? It's saying that any sort of reinterpretation has to be faithful to the original intention. That's good, because that basically means that you're trying to make sure that Vatican I's teachings remain, but they want it to be adapted to a changed cultural context. So in other words, they want a little bit of flowery language. But fundamentally, as long as the original intention is being maintained, I don't really have a problem with this. And then it goes on. It says, a need is expressed to place the doctrine of infallibility in the theological categories of promise, trust, and hope, rather than the juridical categories of law, obligation, and obedience. In other words, it seems to be even saying that the Lutherans could accept some sort of idea of the doctrine of infallibility, whether it be of the Church or of the Bishop of Rome, as long as it's worded in language that they like. Which, again, if you want to be a cynic, that's actually totally fine. I actually fully sympathize with that. If you're like, look, I don't trust the Vatican in its current state, to do this in a way that's, going to actually be productive, I actually agree. I actually think that if you read through this document, I actually kind of get the feeling that these documents are mostly a waste of time, and it's basically just ways for theologians to get little publications on their CVs so that they feel like they're doing productive and it makes them feel tingly inside. I fully agree with that. I'm fully against the expansion of these, ecumenical dialogues. So we're on the same side there. But at the same time, this entire document, while I'm reading it, doesn't actually seem like the world is ending. And in fact, the idea that we can, kind of nuance the language of Vatican I or have a nuanced view of the Bishop of Rome is actually Catholic teaching. Because, there's kind of a meme online where they think that the Bishop of Rome is an absolute monarch. He's a despot. And then you'll see this a lot actually in apologetics. You'll look back in time and they'll say, oh, the Bishop of Rome may have resolved this, but he didn't resolve it in a way where he was bullying everyone else. Therefore, Catholicism is false. But if you actually look, so this is from the book Anti Janus. So this is from slightly before the First Vatican Council. And the author says, even though, the Bishop of Rome and the Pope is monarchical, it is not despotic. Okay, so it is not so unlimited as it has been represented, but is circumscribed by its object, by the spirit and the practice of the church, by primitive tradition, and established rules. Okay, so there are limits on the papacy. In fact, there's an entire book that has been written on this by, I think his name is Greenfield or something like that. But it actually kind of hypothesizes as to what these limits on the papacy are. Obviously, there's the doctrine of collegiality, which we'll get into in a moment as well. But the fact is, there are limits on the papacy, and a lot of these ecumenical dialogues are simply asking, well, what are these limits? And the Catholic Church, even though we've defined things like infallibility and we've defined things like collegiality, we haven't necessarily defined all the minute details on that point. So honestly, an ecumenical call to define these points is totally fair in my opinion. And then we have another point from Anti-Janus where it says, he's talking about papal bulls, and he actually is agreeing with Janus, who's Dollinger, I believe. And he's saying he's actually agreeing with him that we've had too many papal encyclicals written. In other words, he wants a quieter pope. And this is from a totally, Team Ultramontane theologian shortly before the First Vatican Council writing this. So even he is saying that, yeah, there's certain limits on the papacy that we can discuss going forward and try to change these disciplines in a way that are more palatable to people like Janus. So the next one, because you might be saying, you know what, Alexander, that's close to the First Vatican Council. I don't like that, for whatever reason. Well, we can go actually further back in time. So this is from St. Robert Bellarmine. And essentially, in the first part of Bellarmine's book, he's making an argument for the papacy, like an a priori argument. And he's essentially stating, look, monarchy is the better form of government than democracy and aristocracy. Therefore, God would probably choose the better government for his church. Therefore, papacy is probably true. And in chapter 3, he kind of comes out against an absolute monarchy because of, the fallenness of human nature. And he says that if we were to have some supreme prince in the state, so in this case, analogously, that would be the Pope, who commands all and is subject to none, nevertheless, there should be guardians of provinces or cities who are not merely vicars of the king or annual judges, but are true princes who also obey the command of the supreme prince, and meanwhile govern their province or city, not as someone else's property, but as their own. Okay, so what is he saying? You have a supreme prince or a king, and then below him, you have various nobles who also have legitimate real authority in and of themselves. And then essentially, so you have this mixed system. But again, even though the lower judges still have to report in answer to the higher judge, since they have actual real authority, there's going to be some sort of dialogue between them, and there's going to be limits between the authority of both of them. And actually, at the end of this chapter, this is exactly what Bellarmine says happens with the Church of the New Testament, that is, in his view, the Catholic Church, where he says you have the one person in the monarchy, the supreme pontiff on earth, but also that of bishops who are true princes and shepherds, not merely vicars of the supreme pontiff. So again, you have two divinely established institutions. You have the papacy and the episcopate. Both of them are divinely instituted, and one does not go against the other. And they're supposed to be working in harmony with one another. So if you're going to say, what are the exact limits? How do these interact? Can we get a more granular view of the subject? I think, again, that's a totally meaningful and legitimate sort of line of inquiry, which theologians, both today and in the future, can pursue. And then now we can go after the Second Vatican Council, but before the Second Vatican Council, with which some work from Luke Rivington, who's a famous apologist from the post-Vatican I, pre-Vatican II era, as to, things like universal jurisdiction in history as well as infallibility. And here's what he says. He says, the rule of the Pope over the whole church is not, on Vatican principles, a despotic sway. The episcopate has a real office of judgment, though in subordination to his. Okay? So once again, we see these two sort of real institutions that have some sort of relationship with each other. And then he goes on the next page down here. He's talking about Leo's judgment here. Our conclusion is that there is nothing in the history of Theodoret's restoration to prejudice the doctrine of papal supremacy, if that doctrine is to be understood according to the Vatican decrees, and not as teaching that the See of Peter has absolute sway, or is bound to govern as a despot. One alone has absolute authority. The vicar of him who alone absolutely rules the church is supreme in jurisdiction over the church. Okay, so he's the head. We're not rejecting that. But under him, and must act in harmony with the laws which he has laid down. So he's under Jesus, that is, and it must follow in accord with the laws that Jesus has laid down, which include a real, though subordinate, authority of the episcopate at large. Again, so there's sort of a relationship between these two, a collegiality, to use the words of the, post-Vatican II sort of theologians. There's a certain collegiality there. And it's kind of like, if you look at this, there's still open questions. How exactly is that supposed to operate? And I could go into more. I could go into Gasser's Relatio, which is the official interpretation of Vatican I. I could go into the Letter of the German Bishops, which is an excellent document that very clearly teaches collegiality and limits, for example, on papal supremacy in a certain sense, while obviously not rejecting the doctrine. And in fact, Pius IX accepted that document very forcefully. In fact, if I pulled up the book I had in yesterday's stream, which is on Christ Church, Pope, Blessed Pius IX very clearly endorses that point of view. So the idea that we can reinterpret Vatican I in a way that is faithful to the original intention, but is also more palatable to, say, other communions, I actually think could probably be done. Now, if you're going to say, Alexander, I don't think that actually will be done with these ecumenical dialogues, I'd say I probably agree with you. And I fully sympathize. And I should note that this video isn't necessarily a defense of this document. There's a lot of things I don't like about this document. But what I'm trying to say here, though, is that, the big kind of talking points that people are trying to run away with on social media actually could be defensible on some level. And a final point I wish to... Oh, and another thing I don't like about this document is not only do I not like the actual word reinterpretation here, because it implies, I think it's just a terrible word to use. I also think that throughout the document, it'll say, oh, well, we've rediscovered this, we've rediscovered that. But just noting the things that we just went through, we actually aren't really rediscovering much. All of these things already existed within our tradition. So the idea that we are rediscovering stuff from these ecumenical dialogues, I think, is not true. I think these ecumenical dialogues are a waste of time in a way for academics to feel more useful than they actually are. So I actually, again, agree with kind of that sort of more traditionalist critique of these sort of ecumenical dialogues. And the final point I want to make here is that everything problematic that has been quoted in here is old. So it's already coming from these old documents, 1999, 1990, 2000. So they've already been in circulation for decades, and Catholics have already responded to them. So anyone thinking that there's something new in this document is really kind of being disingenuous, because everything in this document has already been in circulation for decades. And obviously, as I noted, when it comes to certain things like the potential to nuance the teachings of the Vatican decrees, these have existed both before, during, and after the First Vatican Council and been around for centuries. So in my opinion, if you're relatively well read, nothing in this document should be especially scandalous to you, and this document should not be of major concern. So that's all I really wanted to say about this document. It looks like I stayed within my goal of a 20-minute or so stream. There doesn't seem to be anyone in the live chat. There only seems to be a couple viewers here. So we can just do a quick and easy stream. That's all I wanted to say. If anyone disagrees with me, feel free to put it in the comments. And hey, if I'm wrong, I'm willing to change my opinion. So that's all I wanted to say about this document, however. So please leave a like, share it, subscribe, all that other good stuff. And if you're new here, please check out our other streams. And if there's any other sort of topic you want me to cover on this channel, just let me know. And if there's any suggestions you have as well to make this better, because again, I'm new at this and have no idea what I'm doing. So thank you, and have a good rest of your weekend.